The Battle of Iwo Jima was from February 19th to March 26, 1945, near the end of World War II. It had many combat casualties, with the Japanese losses being 3 times the Americans.
The U.S. strategies were mainly based off of bombardment, while the Japanese strategies were based off of hiding and fighting from the shadows.
Even after the U.S. was able to seize Iwo Jima, American soldiers had to drive out Japanese who were hiding in undiscovered bunkers. This battle was one of the deadliest in the Pacific War and was the worst tragedy in the U.S. Marine Corps history.
Where there's tragedy, there's triumph. The U.S. was doing island hopping, which was landing one island, liberating it from the Japanese, and sailing to the next.
Iwo Jima was an island with 3 airfields and a volcano named Mount Suribachi, and was within complete heavy bombing proximity of Tokyo. The Japanese needed Iwo Jima to be able to stop U.S. bombers from reaching Tokyo, and the U.S. wanted to use Iwo Jima for their bombers.
So was the Battle of Iwo Jima worth the mistakes and losses, or were the sacrifices for nothing? About a year before the Battle of Iwo Jima, the Japanese realized what it would mean if the U.S. took the island.
Who was appointed to revolutionize Japanese warfare? General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was to be in charge of setting up the defenses on Iwo Jima. Instead of fighting the U.S. directly from the beaches, Kuribayashi connected Iwo Jima's cave systems with tunnels and built 1,500 underground pillboxes, bunkers, and emplacements. As a part of his strategy, Kuribayashi set up some of those bunkers near the beaches to shoot down the arriving Americans. He placed the majority of bunkers deep in the jungles and mountains. The building was difficult, but Iwo Jima was made from soft volcanic rock, so the digging wasn't as exhausting as it should have been, and 2,000 men helped to create the bunkers and tunnels.
The Japanese built spider traps, which were networks of underground passages that could get Japanese snipers into U.S. camps so they could shoot at unsuspecting troops. The spider traps also protected the Japanese troops.
The Japanese were smart to know to prepare in advance and to acknowledge the advantages that the island could grant them, such as the soft volcanic rock and caves, so that they could gain at least one triumph against the Americans. However, the Japanese food, water, and weapons were limited, as the U.S. cut most of them off from their supply, ensuring a great tragedy to come. The Japanese Navy and Air Force had been nearly destroyed by the Americans, so the U.S. bombers and warships were free to bombard Iwo Jima. In addition, the U.S. thought the Japanese would be fighting above ground and would be exposed to bombardment. Starting December 8th, Iwo Jima was bombarded by the Air Force for 74 days. 3 heavy cruisers made some bombings in December and January, and a couple of B-9s made bombardments as well. 6,800 tons of bombs were dropped, including 22,000 5 to 6-inch shells.
Even though there were previous naval bombardments of Iwo Jima in 1944, the Navy started their final bombardment on February 16, 1945. The whole bombardment would be enough to ensure the Americans a quick and easy triumph. Or so they thought.
The Americans made a huge, intimidating landing on Iwo Jima's southern beaches, only to be met with the black volcanic sand that ruined their vehicles. This made the trip forward for the Americans a struggle. It probably didn't help that General Tadamichi Kuribayashi and his Japanese army had opened fire on the Americans. Kuribayashi had cleverly tricked the Americans into thinking that their previous bombardment had completely destroyed the Japanese weapons. In fact, it hadn't, and Kuribayashi was waiting for the right time to use the weapons on the Americans. The Japanese fire was so intense that for 2 days, the Americans were actually forced to urinate while laying down. The shooting was an effective stall against the advancing Americans, and they took many significant casualties. However, the impact was not as significant as the Japanese might have hoped.
With stormy oceans making it impossible to retreat or send reinforcements, the U.S. Marines were forced to push on. Some were sent north to one of the airfields on the island, while some went south to Mount Suribachi. The Japanese were running out of food, water, weapons, and soldiers, so they only attacked during the nighttime when the Americans were least expectant.
The Americans had to dig bunkers of their own to form cover from the incoming Japanese fire. Although the Navy and Air Force had begun to bombard the Japanese again, they had to be careful to not destroy their own American troops. The bombardment wasn't enough, so the Americans had to dig the Japanese out of their own bunkers while fighting them.
The Japanese and Americans continued their intense fighting, with the Japanese refusing to surrender and the Americans refusing to give up. After days of gunfire, explosions, and blood, the Americans finally reached the foot of Mount Suribachi.
As Mount Suribachi was 556 feet, the U.S. Marines knew that their journey up the mountain would be a difficult one. It was mostly foot troops scaling the mountain, because the U.S.'s tanks, for the most part, were destroyed by mines or trapped in sand.
Combined with volcanic sand, this journey didn't look too good for the Americans. They faced immediate issues, such as extremely cold weather and dirt in their clothes. The Japanese on Mount Suribachi, however, were hiding in underground pillboxes. If the Japanese were driven from one pillbox, they would disappear into a higher pillbox and would come back to the original pillbox via a secret tunnel. They would then wait for the Marines to pass and then would throw grenades at them from behind.
In order to counter this tactic, the Americans sent troops around both sides of the mountain. This tactic worked until the Japanese decided to surprise attack the Americans while they were sleeping. They attacked until sunrise and kept the Americans busy with conquering the tunnels and caves in the mountain. Despite all of this, the U.S. ended up conquering Mount Suribachi, which you can see in this widespread photo of the Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi.
Although the Battle of Mount Suribachi was extremely harsh and bloody, the worst had yet to come. Between the steep and rocky terrain, the minefields, the Japanese ambushes, the underground pillboxes and bunkers, the camouflaged pits and trenches, and the volcanic ash and soil, the American advance was slowed down to only a few feet per day. The U.S. was wrong to mainly rely on bombardment and to not consider the advantages and disadvantages of Iwo Jima's landscape. This caused them many great tragedies and gave the Japanese many triumphs. The Marines realized that their strategies weren't working and that they needed to come up with new strategies. To solve their problems, the Marines relied on military engineers. The engineers sent armored bulldozers to plow roads for the Marines to send flamethrowers to the underground Japanese pillboxes, bunkers, and emplacements. The engineers calculated the places where Marines would set certain charges to blow holes in Japanese pillboxes. They would then use flamethrowers to spray fire into the pillboxes to drive the Japanese out. Finally, they would blow all of the holes and entrances shut, so that the Japanese couldn't use the pillbox again.
The engineers knew which features in the ground indicated the minefields, such as loose ground and strange buried objects. They would then have the Marines either disable or trigger the mines to expose any Japanese camouflage trenches. Ambushes became more and more frequent as the Japanese got more and more desperate to defend their island. The U.S. Marines and engineers had to be even more careful, which slowed them down, but spared lives and lessened the tragedies on both sides. On March 25th, 1945, General Kuribayashi and 300 of his Japanese men made their last stand in a northern gorge. The battle would come to be known as Bloody Gorge, for the Japanese had fought to their last man. The next morning, the fighting was over, and the U.S. had won the Battle of Iwo Jima.
The Battle of Iwo Jima was quite brutal for both sides. 6,821 Americans lost their lives to this battle, with over 19,000 Americans wounded. For a battle that lasted just over a month, this was very considerable. What's even more considerable is that 18,000 Japanese lost their lives, with 3,000 forced into hiding on the island. This bloody battle took thousands and thousands of lives, which was the worst tragedy of all.
On the other hand, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a major triumph for the United States. It had marked the first time that the U.S. had invaded Japanese soil, which marked a huge milestone for them. Furthermore, the Battle of Iwo Jima was the United States' penultimate push towards beating Japan and ending World War II. In conclusion, the Battle of Iwo Jima was a significant event in history that we should never forget.